Have you ever felt that something is wrong with the economy, but no one really explains why? Today we're going to analyze one of the most controversial statements by Professor Richard Wolff, an economist who isn't afraid to expose harsh truths about the United States. The country that dominated the world for decades may be crumbling, and if that's true, you need to know how it affects your life. Stay with me until the end because I will reveal what's really happening behind the scenes of the economy and how you can protect yourself from it.
The underlying problems are getting worse. They're not being addressed. There are no plans being formulated. What do you do for a declining empire? We have a president who doesn't know what he's doing. He intuitively feels the theatric that will work in the moment. More serious is his desire to purge across the government everybody who's his political enemy, not whether they've done the national interest a disservice. First of all, he wouldn't find it out in most cases. And number two, that's not the problem for him. The problem for him is they don't see all of this the same way he does, and he can't assume their loyalty, which is true, he can't. So he's going to replace them with people whose loyalty he can control. Let me say that again then. When empires decline, they divide and eat each other up. That's what they do. Look at it this way. Whatever Mr. Trump is doing that exceeds past practice will now be copied by the Democrats. They will do, after the next election, to him what he's doing to them. Especially because if you ask the leading Republicans, they are doing in their minds to the Democrats what the Democrats did to him. Mr. Trump first savaged the Republican establishment, and then he went on to savage the Democrats. This is theater. This is performance. This is all of that crap. Because just between you and me, the bravado there, 51st state to Canada, which will appeal to Americans, will make the Canadians crazy. And in the long run, that's probably not a good idea. And Greenland, really? You're gonna what? Forcibly take property away from a fellow NATO member? You already use Greenland as a base for the American military. They already have bases. They've had them there for many years. Greenland has said, we will give you more bases. If you know anything about Greenland, it is an enormous geography and virtually no people. And the old lesson, which philosophers have figured out for thousands of years, you can't keep using the same methods. You can't reason, it got me here, because what got you here may be what destroys the here you got to. You have to always do the difficult job of assessing an ever-changing. He's not doing it. He's doing more. Here's what an inflation is. It's a decision made by some people to jack up the price you have to pay for the things they can control the prices of. Who sets prices in a capitalist economy? Answer, the employer. Those of you who have had jobs all your life as workers, do you ever recall being called into an office to add your opinion as to what the price should be of what you helped to produce? Never happened. The United States Census tells us 3% of Americans are employers. Welcome to the other 97%. That's you and me. The employers set the prices. We pay them. When they jack up the price, that's because they want to give us fewer of whatever it is they make for the money we have to give them. It's a way of screwing the working class. And that's how it's been used in the last few years. And all these economics professors, including many of mine and people I know, sit around debating. Their decision is we're going to deal with it by raising interest rates. Oh, wow, this is wonderful. Who gets screwed when you raise an interest rate? In case you're not rich yourself, I'm going to tell you, it's not rich people. They don't give a flying whether the interest rate is 2%, 6%. They're rich. That's what it means to be rich. You don't care. But you have to care because it's going to mean that little bit of money at the end of the month that you have to pay on your credit card is going to be bigger than it was before. And everything works like that. The rich don't care. You know what that's like? It's like, I'm going to stick it to you now for a moment, congestion pricing. Oh, good. We have a problem in New York with traffic. This should come as hot news. It's only been true for a century. And we're going to finally do something. Oh, really? Yeah, what? We're going to tax everybody the same. What? The same. A rich person who will not give a damn, and the poor person for whom this adds up as an extra buck or two every time you do something, if you have to come in and out of Manhattan, etc., etc. Only an American politician who's just seen what inflation has done to people would come up with that solution. I want to remind you, International Monetary Fund has announced the results. The U.S. GDP grew in 2024 by about 2.7, 2.8%. And the GDP of the People's Republic of China grew at 5%. You've got to deal with this because you didn't in 2024. You're not. You have been unable to stop the Chinese from that kind of a performance. So what are you going to do? Nothing. You ask the question and everybody looks at you, as if you just asked how heavy the number 4 is or what color is Thursday. In other words, you're asking questions, the categories of which make no sense because people don't want to see it. Mr. Biden's influence on the economic conditions of our society are marginal. Mr. Trump's in his first presidency were marginal. Most of the things he boasted about, he couldn't do. He built a wall, along the Mexican border. More Mexicans came, not fewer. That was 100% bust. Now he's proposing, as you probably know, and I heard as I was coming over here today, that ICE is going to be raiding cities across America and throwing people into Mexico. Yeah, he may do some of that. Maybe he'll do a lot of it. Who knows? If he actually does it, if he actually takes the 10 to 15 undocumented immigrants in the United States and puts them into Mexico, we're going to have meetings like this, only it's going to be about Mexico. Mexico lives off the remittances, the money earned by Mexican people here that they're sending back to their mother, their father, their children, back home. And that flow of money is an absolute blessing to Mexico. It doesn't have to sell anything. It doesn't have to export anything. It just gets the money shipped by its expatriates here. Imagine that suddenly gets stopped because they're not here anymore. They lost their job and they were deported back to Mexico. But it gets worse. They're arriving in Mexico at a time when Mr. Trump is threatening them or hitting them with tariffs, which is killing the market Mexico had in the United States, its biggest buyer of its output, including many automobiles made by Ford and General Motors in Mexico for export here. Those goods are not going to be able to come in here without a tariff, which means we're not going to be buying them, which means the Mexicans are going to be laying people off. When the money from remittances isn't coming and the millions are coming looking for the work that will not be there. You know what that's going to make out of Mexico? A disaster that's going to remind everyone else of the sad country of Haiti. A disaster of gangs and American tourism there. Bye-bye. That's the kind of chaos that's coming out of the denial. If a dying empire wants to cannibalize its allies to get through the decline better, then that's going to be what the Democrats do. It's going to be what the Republicans do, with some differences, but they'll all be eating the lunch of their allies to give them a bit more time on this earth. They'll sacrifice them. When the empire declines, when the economic system, whether it has an empire or not, declines, those at the top, those with the power and the wealth, use their power and wealth to minimize the effect on themselves of the declining environment. So they offload the burden onto the middle and lower classes. That's why we don't raise the minimum wage here. That's why the Republicans are going to cut all kinds, or try to cut all kinds of social spending. That's why the Europeans are desperate in that situation. If the Europeans do what the Americans are demanding, raise their defense expenditures, how are they going to pay for that? Answer, they're going to cut their social spending. And they're going to get a lot of support from a Republican mentality in the United States for doing that. Don't take so seriously what Mr. Trump is bloviating about these days. He's continuing the theater that got him elected. At this point, we don't know what he's actually going to try to do. We do not know whether it can be done, and we do not know what retaliation the victims of what he's doing will themselves figure out. But they're not all going to be passive and sit there and say we have to accept it. You might see the billionaires go down there, get down on one knee and beg for, yeah, he wants that, they do it. But the rest of the world, not so much. Doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for the king of this or the prime minister of that to play that kind of role, and they're not going to do it. And the United States is less able to compel that behavior today than it has been for the last half century. And what's going on now is also typical empire decline. Let me give you the most glaring example. We have a minimum wage, a federal minimum wage, designed to protect the poorest of the poor. And the federal minimum wage in this country is $7.25 an hour. And believe me, if that's what you're paid, you're a poor person. But that's what we have. The last time it was raised by the people who run this country, the U.S. Congress, was in the year 2009, which means in the last 16 years, and in every one of those 16 years, prices rose in America, which meant that the $7.25 per hour that those poor millions got could afford fewer goods each year. We have, as a nation, savaged the people at the bottom. What kind of country does that? Try. I live in New York City. Try to live in New York City on $7.25 an hour. There'll be so much month at the end of the money that you'll be standing around supplementing your income with a cap in your hand. And what did we do to the people to whom we paid the lowest salary? $7.25. We didn't raise it. Republicans didn't raise it. Democrats didn't raise it. You know what that is? That's cruel and unusual punishment given to people whose crime is that they're poorly paid in the first place. Here's another sign. Our real wages have been stagnant for 30 to 40 years. In other words, if you measure, as we do in economics, the average wage in dollars paid to American workers, and you adjust that to the prices they have to pay when they spend their wages, it's been going up somewhere around 0.5% a year. That's called stagnation. That means your wage isn't going anywhere. By the way, in contrast, the average real wages in the People's Republic of China have quadrupled over the same 30 years. If you want to understand why the government in China is secure, why it is powerful, why economic growth there is celebrated, I just gave you the statistic. Their average wage quadrupled. The average wage in the United States went nowhere. China has overtaken the United States in dozens of fields, particularly the highest tech ones. Young people around you are using TikTok. That's Chinese as a social media. What's going on? The United States doesn't know what to do. Having not learned the lessons, having not understood what denial means, for a long time, they denied. Because to see the rise of China is to take a step in the direction that might make you confront what's happening to you. And that's a taboo. You're going to make this even worse because Americans know and have told our government that the Chinese continue to improve their technology so that they're going to be even cheaper and even better than the Americans and others competing with them are likely to be for years into the future. That's how far ahead the Chinese have achieved. The poor capitalists are stuck. What they do to solve a problem makes another problem worse. That's another sign of decline. On people not understanding these basics, and so finding this to be some sort of argument as if the Chinese have cheated. No, they didn't. They outdid you. Competition always has winners and losers. And I know that here in America, I'm born and raised here, we cannot imagine the United States losing ever anything. But we do. We lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. But Americans need to believe that we're always winning. The tariffs are a sign that American dominance, which we got used to after World War II, from the second half of the 20th century, was the dominance of the United States. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, it left the United States in what political scientists like to call a unipolar moment. But that's over now. The United States isn't what it was, and the Chinese and their allies have become a powerful new competitor. And the United States is having a hard time adjusting, which I can understand. It's like the British. Took them a century to realize that the British Empire wasn't there anymore. And some of them still haven't understood it. The United States is at an earlier stage. The sanctions you see, the tariffs you see, that's a switch to protectionism by a society that has no confidence in its own company's ability to compete. We used to. That's when the U.S. was the champion of free trade around the world. That's because we could win in those situations. We were the most technologically dynamic. We were the fastest growing, but we're not anymore. And we haven't been for a generation now. And it's beginning to impact us day by day. And nobody should be fooled by leaders who continue to sanction and to tariff as if we were free to do that without consequences. Here's the most important bottom line for Americans. If you raise the price of the tariff, if you raise the cost of imported goods, whether they are solar panels or semiconductor chips or electric vehicles or any of the other items, if you put a tariff on them, it means everything coming in from abroad costs much more, which allows the American competitors to charge more than they could have ever gotten away with if they had had to compete. And if everybody does that, you know what that contributes to? Inflation. We're supposed to be a nation worried about inflation. Tariffs are inflationary, and they always have been. And so the irony here is you're flailing around. This is mostly political posturing. Look, the inflation is pricing people out of the supermarket, out of the department store across America. That means fewer jobs in supermarkets and fewer jobs in department stores.
Over the last 20 years, has increased its output of goods and services faster than any other country on this planet. This is not an exercise in we're good, they're bad. That comes from the Cold War, which was supposed to have ended in 1989-90, but clearly hasn't. Or at least the Cold War is alive and kicking in the minds of some of our fellow citizens, which is too bad, because it prevents the kind of balanced approach looking at the pros and the cons that a mature, intelligent conversation ought to be about. Capitalism has strengths and weaknesses. Socialism is an alternative, and it has strengths and weaknesses, and we'd all be better off if we were able to talk about all of that without resorting to childish invocations of how we're good and they're bad. Let me begin by talking about what economists often talk about when comparing different kinds of societies, comparing different countries. You might remember that Adam Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776, was about explaining why some nations are wealthy and some nations are not, to account for that, to understand it. And part of that was a very generous impulse. Mr. Smith understood that poor countries would like to not be poor and wanted to learn what the rich countries might be able to teach them about how to get to that situation. Well, China was one of the poor countries at the time Adam Smith wrote, and it got poorer after that. So that by, say, the 20th century, the last 100 years or so, the Chinese people were not only the most numerous people of any country on Earth, they remain today the most populous country on this planet by far, but also because they were very poor, that the capitalist part of the world had grown much richer in the intervening couple of centuries, so they were even further behind, as well as being absolutely poor. So they were focused, like most of the people in the world, on overcoming poverty. So that's been their major goal, and it's a reasonable place to start to assess how well they've done. And if these numbers trouble you, then please understand it's because you did not know about them before, not because there's anything wrong with the numbers. Over the last 20 years, the People's Republic of China has increased its output of goods and services faster than any other country on this planet. And in the case of the comparison, say, between the People's Republic of China on the one hand and the United States of America on the other, they're not even close. Let me explain with some numbers. The rate of growth of output of goods and services, the productivity of the economy, if you like, in 2005 was 11%. In 2017, it was 15%. In 1 year. In 2010, it was 12%, and it has slowed down since then, and over the last year, it was a mere 6.4%. So in other words, if you wanted to average it out, it was probably in the neighborhood of 10, 11% over the last 10, 15, 20 years. By comparison, let me give you the numbers for the United States of America. Its average growth rate in the 1950s and 60s was 4%. In the 70s and 80s, it fell to 3%. And in the last 10 years, it has averaged 2%. In the latest period, the latest year, it was 3.2%, half of what it was in China. But for most of the last 20 years, the rate of growth of China has been 2 to 3 to 4 times that of the United States. And that, in a simple way, tells us something. Number one, it explains why we're reading and hearing so much about China, because they have become the second most important economy in the world because they have achieved these extraordinary rates of economic growth. Number two, it'll help you understand something else about the people of China. They are not about to be pushed around, neither by Mr. Trump nor anybody else, because they have the economic strength to resist. And number three, if you're the government of the People's Republic of China, and that is a government in which the Communist Party of China is dominant, you are hardly about to change the way you organize your economy, given how well it has been doing. Governments change, either willingly or under pressure, when they're doing badly for their people. It makes people bitter, angry, critical, and liable to push for change. This is something Americans no doubt understand, since it's the situation we face here in American capitalism, or in Europe with their capitalism. That's not doing real well for an enormous number of people. And as a consequence, criticisms are rising. You see a rediscovery of socialism, for example, here in the United States. You see the Yellow Vest movement demanding fundamental changes in France. And you see all kinds of other movements, but this is already enough to explain to you why the People's Republic of China is the economic phenomena of our time. Let me turn next to the second most typical statistic to look at if you're comparing countries and you're trying to understand what's going on with the development or not of wealth and poverty. This number is called the real wage. Here's what it means. How much can people afford to buy with the average wages they get? And to understand that, we look at two numbers. First, how much money is given to people per hour for the work they do. And on the other hand, what are the prices of the things they buy with the wages they get? In other words, if your wage goes up by 10%, but so do all the prices you face, you're not one whit better off. Yeah, you got 10% more money, but it doesn't buy you anything but the same quantity of things it bought you before. So when we adjust the wages workers get for the prices they have to pay, we get what's called the average real wage, what you can afford with the money you get. So let's compare the last 20 years in the United States, that is this century so far, in the United States with that in China. So here we go. In the United States, real wages, the actual average wage of the American worker, has stagnated. It has gone nowhere. That's true not only for the 20 years we're talking about of this century, it's true for the last 25 years of the 20th century. Here's a statistic for you to think about as an American if you're watching this program from the United States or listening to it on the radio here. In 1973, the wage of the United States, average wage of an American, was able to buy, here we go now, more things than it was in 2018. The real wage in the United States is less today than it was then. It's not less by a lot, but it means that over the last 40 to 45 years, Americans who have worked harder than ever, who have been more productive than they ever were across that time, have not shared in their greater productivity. Their real income, their real wages have not gone up. The real hourly wage in the United States is lower today than it was in 1973, and that is something to think about. But now comes the Chinese story. Over the same period of time, just counting the last 25 years, real wages in the People's Republic of China have quadrupled. Let me tell you that again. The basket of goods and services that an average worker gets in China for an average hour of his or her work is 4 times greater today than it was 25 years ago. Yes, Chinese wages remain below the average in the United States because they were, and they still are, a poor country when you divide their total economy by the enormous number of people that live in that country. But if you want to understand why the people of China support their government, here's a clue. Their real wages went up 4 times over the last 25 years in a society led by a government in which the Communist Party is the dominant political force. Let me pause to let all of this sink in. This is not about whether you like these numbers or don't. This is not about whether you're critical of many aspects of Chinese society or you're not. I myself find things in China I admire and things in China I would like to avoid. I try to look at their strengths and weaknesses. But when it comes to the economics of their socialist system, and I compare it in its performance over decades to this moment, there is no contest about which system has served its people better in terms of economic growth of output, the economy as a whole, and the real wages of the average worker in that society. Is China an example of equality? No. It has a great deal of inequality. There, the United States and China have something in common. High inequality that's actually getting worse. Having shown the remarkable success of their economic growth program in both those ways, I want to turn now to how they did that. How do they organize their economy, and particularly in what ways differently from that of the United States or Western Europe that might help us account for their extraordinary performance? First, and perhaps most important for many of you that are watching and listening, is to understand that the Chinese economy for quite some time now has had a mixture of privately owned enterprises and state-owned enterprises. You might think of it as a mixed economy between private and state. It is also true over the last 20-25 years that the role of the private sector has been enlarged relative to the role of the state sector. However, that has to be made a little more complicated by noting that the Chinese, in managing this balance between the state and the private, give the dominance to the state. They say that the state-owned enterprises will always be the leading sectors, the main industrial groups within the Chinese economy. There's plenty of room for private enterprises, but the leading part of the economy will be the state. Why are the Chinese doing that? First and foremost, they are doing it because it's their way of learning from the experience of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union's kind of socialism, in which the state was overwhelmingly dominant and the private sector was really quite restricted, when the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself in 1989, it went through an extremely quick transition from an overwhelmingly state industrial sector to an overwhelmingly private one. This was pushed by the folks in Russia who wanted these changes. It was pushed by foreign advisors led by Jeffrey Sachs, now of Columbia University. It was called a kind of cold shower treatment, or sometimes shock therapy, as a way of fixing what was understood to be wrong. The Chinese analysis is that the suffering of the Russian people in the 30 years since then, the failures of the Russian economy in the 30 years since then, had largely to do with the excessive speed and the excessive extent of what happened in the Soviet Union, and they have been determined not to repeat that mistake. In other words, their Communist Party's plan is to make the transition slow and limited. Yes, foreign enterprises can come in if they're private capitalist enterprises, and many have. Yes, Chinese people can set up private enterprises, as many have. But the leading sectors of the economy will remain state-owned enterprises running the program of economic development that the state organizes under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. It's important to understand that the Chinese kind of socialism is itself a learning process in which what happened to the Soviet system is playing a major role, in this case, of what not to do in the way that happened in the Soviet Union. But it is not the only factor that's involved. To continue the comparison with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was the first socialist country and completely isolated after the 1920s, surrounded by a world that hated what they were doing, they couldn't and didn't find a way to build their economy by exporting. They could not produce for the rest of the world, make a lot of money that way, and use it to develop their own economy. They had to do it pretty much on their own. The Chinese have taken a different path there as well. Early on, the Chinese decided, the end of the last century, the beginning of this one, to hitch their economic wagon to the world market, to become the producer of goods and services for sale around the world. And in order to do that, they had to build industries that produced what the rest of the world did, either at a higher quality or at a lower price, or both. And basically, they've done that, which is why Chinese automobiles, Chinese appliances, Chinese clothing, Chinese you fill in the blank, is everywhere. Most of what you will see in an average Walmart is made in China, and there's a reason why Walmart stocks up on Chinese good, and they're not the only company, of course. So they hitched their wagon to the world market, and they've done very, very well because of it. The Russians couldn't do that, and the Chinese could, and they did. Here's another thing. Private capitalists didn't go into Russia hardly at all, but they have been rushing, stumbling all over themselves to get into China. And the Chinese understand that, and they offered Western capitalist enterprises the following deal. We need your technology, the Chinese said. We need your money, your capital, to be invested. So here's the deal we offer you. We will provide you with well-disciplined, efficient, hard-working workers at a very low wage, the one that we have here in our poor country. And we will build the roads and provide the supports for you to be able to make a lot of money producing here in China more cheaply than you could ever produce in America or Western Europe or Japan, etc. All we ask in exchange is that you share your advanced technology, because that's why we're doing this with you. You will have access to our workers, and you will have access to our customers to sell your product. But we want your technology and your capital. Nobody put a gun to any capitalist's enterprise's head. They made the decision to accept the offer of the Chinese because it was profitable for them to do so. If it meant that they laid off workers in their home countries, these capitalist enterprises, they could care less. They did that. They abandoned whole industries. They abandoned whole communities. That's how capitalism has always worked. Only this time, this destruction of working people in the West was a boon to the workers of China, which is why I gave you the numbers about the average real wage. So the Chinese used the world market, the deal they struck with private capitalists, and the lessons they learned from the Soviet Union to organize what they call a special Chinese kind of socialism that allows for private enterprise a considerable amount, allows for market dealings a considerable amount, but controls from the top through the state-owned enterprises the leading or dominant sectors of the Chinese economy. China is an old civilization and a quite homogeneous civilization. The Han people are the dominant ethnic group, and other ethnicities are small and scattered. The Chinese are a proud people with a long history of a pretty well-developed civilization, which at various times over the last couple of thousand years was much more developed than civilizations in the West were. So for them it was doubly embarrassing, humiliating is the word they used, to fall under the control of foreign colonialists in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, from Britain, from France, from Germany, from the United States. It culminated in a horrible moment of rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the 19th century, when a futile effort by the Chinese authorities to push back against the Western imperialists was defeated. China was never made into a colony. They're very proud of that. But they had to give away Hong Kong and parts of their country to the foreigner who controlled them, who settled their merchants and other companies in these special territories where they didn't find themselves subject to Chinese authority or Chinese law. And the Chinese as a people made a commitment to find their own way, to break, led by Sun Yat-sen at the beginning of the 20th century. And when that wasn't sufficient, and when they were added the humiliation of the invasion of their country by the Japanese in the 1930s, a revolt of a much deeper sort took place in China. They were successful. At first, it was an alliance between the nationalists who wanted to build up a capitalist China and the communists who wanted to build up a socialist China, but they worked together to push the Japanese out. And by 1945, they had done so together with the fight of the United States and its allies against Japan. And as soon as World War II was over, the alliance between the capitalist/nationalist Chinese under their leader Chiang Kai-shek ended up in a civil war with the communists, their former allies, led by Mao Zedong. and a civil war broke out from 1945 to 1949, ending with the decisive and complete victory of the Communist Red Army. The Chiang Kai-shek people left the mainland of China and went to Taiwan, where their descendants still live and still imagine that they, on the little island, are China, whereas the vast mass of people on the mainland are something else. No one hardly is left in the world who shares this delusion. From 1949 to now, 70 years, historically not a long time, but from a decimated, poor, colonialized country, China is now the number 2 economy in the world, and it is an incredible achievement. And not to understand that, not to understand what this means in the minds, in the feelings, and in the pocketbooks of the Chinese people, not to understand that it has involved moving 400 to 500 million people off of the poverty-stricken countryside into the urban industrial jobs along the coast of China. These are misunderstandings that make no sense. You are not helped in understanding, let alone fixing the problems of the world, by living in the delusion that the things I've tried to get across today are not the case, don't have to be taken into account, and somehow don't matter. Unfortunately, in the mainstream media of the United States and in other parts of the West, most of this is simply not reported on, not covered, evaded. That doesn't do anyone a service, unless it's the people who run the kinds of society China isn't, who are afraid of the model and the example China offers.
China is a lender to the United States government. China has been demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of U.S. debt by hundreds of billions of dollars to the whole world. Economic growth is faster in the East than it is in the West. The G7 and the BRICS had the same total GDP in the year 2020. Now the BRICS have about 3 or 4% more than the G7. Capitalism has always had financial problems. The way the system works produces financial problems. Here in the United States, we have a governmental system that works as follows. On the one hand, you have corporations and the rich. They are a minority, but they provide the money for political parties. The political party, Republican and Democrat, spend an enormous amount of money. They buy time on television. Everything is done by mass media, by social media, and so forth. So for a candidate or a party to win, they need to get a lot of money. And that money comes overwhelmingly from corporations and the rich. And they don't want to be taxed. So what corporations and the rich want from the government is lots of service. They want 800 military bases so that nobody will interfere with exports or imports or all of that. They want the government to help them, to educate workers so that they are productive, to all of that. Prisons, we have an enormous prison population, all of that. Then there are the mass of people, the working class, the employees. They too want services from the government. They want schools, they want hospitals, they want roads to be working, and so forth. And they don't want to pay taxes either, but they're not so powerful. They don't have any money to give the politicians, but they give them votes. And the politicians, once a year, need some votes. So we have the following capitalist system. Politicians, faced with the need to raise money from corporations and the rich, but without the power really to tax them. Because if you tax them, they won't give you the money. They'll give the money to somebody else who's running against you. You'll be out of there within the next year or two, and in will come somebody who plays the game. And likewise, you can't keep putting the taxes on the mass of people because they don't have enough. And they're going to rise up again. That's dangerous. So you have to provide services, but you can't tax. How do you handle that problem? And the way the capitalists have handled that problem in the West is by borrowing, because that way we can spend it on what people need, but without taxing them. It's just, and they will vote for us and they will give us money. And that's how it works. But the problem is you accumulate an enormous national debt, adding up each year's deficits between what the government spends and what it raises in taxes. The important thing to understand about this, though, which many people don't, is that this is very good for corporations and the rich for as long as it lasts. Why? Because when the government borrows, who does it borrow from? It borrows from corporations and the rich. Nobody else has money to lend to the government. The government lets corporations and the rich not pay taxes and then comes back to them and says, lend the government the money that you didn't. For corporations and the rich, this is, of course, wonderful. Instead of paying taxes, say goodbye to your money, they get to give the government a loan, which the government will pay back plus interest on the loan. So for corporations and the rich, going ever deeper into debt is perfectly acceptable, which is why corporations and the rich are now permitting, here in the United States, we run deficits in the trillions of US dollars every year, like this year. And corporations and the rich, they worry only because at a certain point, when you borrow more and more, you run the risk that some of the lenders, the very corporations and the rich, will decide it is too risky. You are so in debt that there may be an uprising from the people which will say you cannot repay the debt. You have to take care of us first. Now, China is a lender to the United States government. China and Japan are the number 1 and 2 lenders to the US government. China has been reducing, demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of US debt by hundreds of billions of dollars over the last few years. This is an important sign that in China, too, there's the beginning of the worry that the debts are going up so fast that you're getting closer to a crisis when the mass of people say, we will not continue to pay the taxes. You need to repay the debt, which you only got because you weren't willing to tax corporations and the rich. That's why in the United States, an enormous amount of time and energy is spent by leading economists to explain deficits and national debts in every conceivable way other than what I've just told you, because they don't want the mass of people to realize that a debt is simply postponing the burden of taxation on the employees in order to benefit the employers who get out of paying a tax and have a government loan instead. If the mass of people understood what I've just told you, then they would not allow this kind of deficit spending, and they would demand that taxes be raised on corporations and the rich because they have evaded their share of taxes for many years and because they are the richest and therefore most able to pay to get out. But my guess is we're not going to solve this problem until it blows up. And if you ask me, when will it blow up? I can't answer that question, because that's a question really of when does capitalism run out of its mechanisms to stay in power? I think that capitalism is declining everywhere in the world, with the exceptions, perhaps, of Asia. And now comes my important point, I think. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen the latest relocation of the dynamic center of capitalist industry and growth. It has left Western Europe, it has left North America, and it has left Japan. And it has gone, above all, to the People's Republic of China, but also to places like India and Brazil and Vietnam and other parts of the world. But it has left the old part. And that is how capitalism has always worked. It has always relocated following where profits were the greatest. And so, for example, here in the United States, many companies, many of our largest corporations over the last 40 years grew their enterprises in China or in India or in Brazil or in Vietnam. Wages were lower, India, China, and Brazil, and the economic market was growing faster than in Europe, North America, and Japan. And we are seeing the consequences for those that are able to see it, who are able to admit it, who are not blinded by their own ideology. And I have to tell you that in much of Europe and in much of North America, the major response to the relocation of capitalism to the East, mostly to the South and the East, has been what psychologists call denial. They haven't admitted it. Politicians have felt that what they must say to the people is that we are strong and we are powerful and we are what we were. This has happened before in history. It takes some time before the people living through the relocation of capitalism will finally be able to face it, to admit it, and to begin to deal with it. We're not there yet. And whether you look at the war in Ukraine, or you look at foreign policy of the West, or you look, for example, at the conflict around Taiwan in the South China Sea, you see a West that still thinks it has the dominant power. It doesn't. And the statistic I use to drive this point home to people is that if you look at the GDP, the gross domestic product, which measures the total output of goods and services in 1 year, if you look at the total GDP of the United States and its major allies, the G7, United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, it is significantly less right now than the GDP of China and its allies in the BRICS, BRICA, that other new alliance. So that tells the whole world economic growth is faster in the East than it is in the West. The G7 and the BRICS had the same total GDP in the year 2020. Now the BRICS have about 3 or 4% more than the G7. And that shows you that the gap between them is getting larger. This is reshaping global capitalism and all world affairs. We are living through that, but I think the important thing is to realize that this is what's going on, to understand that every country in the world, your country, my country, all are now rethinking their foreign policies, their place in the world, the future of their industries, because the economic situation of the world economy is changing so dramatically. A childish inability to face the problem, coupled with theatrics instead of a serious program. I want to remind everyone, we just had a presidential election in which neither candidate on either side said a word about we are facing a declining empire. Not a word. This is a country that is engaged in what psychologists call denial. I understand that. I'm an American, born and lived and worked here all my life, and I'm surrounded by fellow Americans. I'm afraid I'm the one that has to say to them, look, we've got problems, and here's one of them. We are weaker than we were, but that can't be confronted. No one dares say that. We don't have enough jobs for our own people. We can't pay our own people properly. We are hysterical as a nation with the problems we can't solve and the magical scapegoats with which our leaders propose to distract us. I'm going to begin with a kind of a sad story, but it is so powerful in talking about the decline of the empire that you might have missed it. Bus lines in America carry more passengers each year than the Amtrak railroad system. It's a more important mechanism of transport. Roughly 60 million Americans rely on intercity bus travel. The average income of bus riders is under $40,000 per year. Okay, in other words, this is for the poorer part of the American population as a way to get from one city to another. So what's happening? Well, all across the country, the bus stations are closing. They're gone. And if they're not gone where you are, they soon will be. What's going on? Now we see the power of the empire. It's more profitable to use the land, typically in a downtown area, for that bus station. It's much more profitable to do something for the rich. Build an expensive condo project. Build an expensive mall downtown. Build an expensive, I was about to say office tower, but that doesn't work so well in America. After the pandemic, we don't need more of those. So what's happening is that real estate hustlers figured out a way to make a lot of money, to buy the often run-down bus station location for no other purpose than to tear it to the ground and replace it with something serving who? Well, the profitable people, the top 10% with the money to pay for those fancy condos, those expensive malls, and all the rest. So my parting final words, most of what's about to happen is not about Mr. Trump or what he does or doesn't do. His capacity for saying one thing and doing another is already legendary. You don't need me to remind you of it. But whatever he in fact does is marginal. Most of what is going to happen to you and me is going to depend on two things. One, what the rest of the world does as it watches and navigates the decline of the American empire. So it's actually more important what Xi Jinping and Mr. Modi and Lula in Brazil and so forth and so on. And that remarkable woman who's now the head of Mexico, who has her work cut out for her. She has a very famous Hispanic name. Scheinbaum is her name. But she's the one to watch, because what she does, faced with what I've just described to you, that's going to be powerful, whatever it is. So it's the outside that's going to affect us more than our own political leaders, because we don't have the power and they don't anymore. Plus, we are so lost in denial that we don't know what we're doing. That's why we miscalculated in Ukraine. They're out of touch, not just with the American people, but with the world reality. Watch them. This morning, I read a story in a major American financial newspaper about the International Monetary Fund saying that the United States would grow 2.7% in the year 2024, and thereby lead the world economy. I couldn't believe it. It's so gross. By the way, the number's correct. 2.7% is what the IMF has now said, but that's not leading the world economy. That's lousy. Chinese growth this year will be 5%, and the Indian growth will be 7%. The United States isn't leading anything except here in its own weird mentality. And what's the other thing? The second thing, beside the outside dominating the inside? It's you. We are the unknown. Will the American people allow themselves to be the ones who get screwed as this empire passes? It's the same question that the British working class had to face when the British Empire collapsed over the last century. We, whether women building up or formerly incarcerated people, will they get together? Will they make movements? Will they make demands? Will they make coalitions with one another to realize those demands? That's the wild card everywhere. By the way, there are think tanks all over America that are asking the same question. They're worried. Is the labor movement waking up in a way that could change all of this? People were being worked at unbelievable stress in Amazon warehouse for years.
or in Starbucks coffee shops for years. But in the last 2 or 3 years, enough is enough, no more, we're gonna, that remarkable group, Chris Smalls and folks out there in Staten Island, that's a remarkable and has had effects everywhere else. The Boeing workers on the West Coast rejected 3 contracts before they accepted the one that they found, which was better than the ones that they had rejected. The labor movement, that's the question. If this gives you a swell head, that's my point. It is more in your hands than you think of, because in addition to saving yourselves, if it's a time of decline, if the people who run this society are so busy denying it, refusing to face it, as I've tried to show you, then we are stronger than we might suspect, and they are weaker than they might feel confident about. And that's a good time for us to act. The conditions are pretty good, not terrible, as some of my fellow leftists are worrying about. Of course, we have problems and difficulties. I'm not pretending otherwise. But we also have an historical moment that the old Cold War mentality, that everything to the left is evil, bad, won't work, is dead. That generation died and took it with him. Young people today don't have that mentality. They're much more open to what it is. And so I want you to remember that I'm just the messenger. I didn't make these things happen, but I do want to honestly tell you, because we live now in a weird time.
If there's one thing this analysis has revealed, it's that you can't count on the government to save your financial life. You need to act now. In the pinned comment, I've left some books that will help you better understand this reality and, more importantly, find ways to thrive in this scenario. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment below. Is the US really in decline, or does it still have a chance to bounce back? Let's discuss it in the comments. See you next time.